So, can you guys hear me okay in the back? All good? I'll try not to shiver my way through this whole thing because I'm a little cold. But so I want to ask you guys a question. What is the one question that you're bound to get within the first 10 minutes of meeting someone? Who has an answer? What do you do? That's exactly what it is, what we usually get. And usually what I find is that there's this second unspoken half of that question, which is, what do you do for a living? Or also in these kind of change the world communities, like the Do lectures, there's this other unspoken end to that sentence, which is, what do you do that matters? I think that we're trying to be very action-oriented because there's so many ideas out there. But this question I want to put out there is, do we stop to ask ourselves, what are the questions that are driving us to do? So like most children, I was one of those kids that asks a lot of questions. And when I was a kid, I lived in Los Angeles, and I would drive in the backseat of the car up into the hills to get to school for an hour every day, because that's the Los Angeles way, is to commute for an hour every day to go everywhere you're going. And then as I would come down the hill, I would notice that we would drive down into this thick, grayish, purplish smog cloud. And I remember asking, why is there smog? And the grown-ups would answer, oh, well, you know, it's too bad, but that's just the way things are. And I remember being troubled by this feeling that doesn't make sense, that there's this smog and that's just the way things are. Is that the way that, you know, the Earth was designed, is to have this cloud of smog? That doesn't make sense. But when I was about 11 years old, I took this environmental ethics class, and then I learned where smog came from. And then I realized that smog was actually composed of this toxic pollution that was coming from the way our energy was produced, and it was coming from all the cars that were surrounding us. And I became afraid to breathe as a little girl. Like walking through Los Angeles, it just became almost paralyzing to breathe. And I came home, and my father noticed that I was really disturbed, and I was trying, you know, when your daughter's trying not to breathe, you know, there's a problem. And I asked him this question. I asked him, Papa, what are you going to do to clean up the air? And maybe it's that naivety of being a child and thinking that your papa really can clean up the air. But this became a question that he lived his way into answering. And he, you know, at first we discussed different ideas of what we could do or what would be possible. And his answer was entrepreneurial. And he created a clean energy company called Green Mountain Energy. And the idea was to connect consumers to where their electricity came from, and to actually empower consumers to choose clean electricity that was powered by wind and other renewables. So while I was busy in school, I was studying ecology and trying to save the whales and the bats and the mountain lions and the frogs. He spent about 15 years working with an amazing team to build this company, which we actually sold last year to a company called NRG. And that's a wonderful, in the States, progressive renewable energy company. But during those 15 years, our customers helped to avoid more than 11.3 billion pounds of carbon dioxide emissions, which is equivalent to taking over 52 million cars off the road for a week, or 473 million households turning off their lights for a week, or would be the equivalent of 478 million trees would absorb in 1 year. And we spurred the development of over 40 new wind and solar facilities across the nation. And Green Mountain is still growing. In fact, now it now powers the Empire State Building, that iconic building in New York City. And this success answered a big question for me that I was living at the time, which is it possible to create companies that are both financially and ecologically sustainable? And this was really a core question for me, because I had seen so many people grow great companies that had such terrible ecological consequences. And although my family had empowered me from a very young age to understand these worlds of business and investment, it had no allure to me whatsoever. I was wanting to save the bats and the frogs and the whales and the toads and, you know, all these beautiful creatures, and this whole business thing was just so boring, you know. But I was asking myself this question: what can I do that matters? And so, seeking answers to that questions, I decided to explore eco-villages and to make a documentary on eco-villages. So I traveled all around the world. I went from New Zealand to Hawaii to Costa Rica to Texas and Tennessee to Italy, and I lived for days, weeks, months in these different sustainable communities, wanting to answer the question, can we live sustainably? Is there a way of living in this world that isn't harmful to the earth? And I learned all kinds of things in the process. It was the first time, after growing up kind of a city girl, that I actually got my hands dirty and that I harvested apples. And I took this amazing class called the Post-Peak Oil Permaculture Natural Building and Eco-Village Design course, which was really mind-blowing, just even the title, you know, like I had to write it up there. In the course of that journey, I did answer that question that yes, there are ways to live on this earth without causing harm, and there are ways to do so painfully, and there are ways to do so joyfully. There's lots of different ways of living sustainably in the world. But for me, I found that living in these communities was so isolated from society, and truly successful ones were really few and far between. And that if I created or joined a community, I could possibly be happy there, but it still didn't answer that primary question of what can I do that matters. But it had planted the seed in me of connecting communities of change makers, so that one day I met this guy, Brian, and he had this idea for building an online community for people who wanted to change the world. And I literally did not hesitate. It was so right that I jumped in. And, so we asked ourselves this question: can we build a successful business through inspiring, empowering, and connecting people? And we built Zods.com. Zods was a play on the Dutch word for seed, which for us represented this idea that each person had the seed of potential within them, and could we help create a community that would help foster the flourishing of people's potential. So within months, we hosted the space for hundreds of thousands of people worldwide to voice their visions, to share part of themselves online, and part of themselves that many of them could not share with their own peers or their own families. And Zods planted many seeds. There were businesses that were started, there were organizations that were started, there were people that got married and had children. It did actually serve this role in the world of connecting these different communities of change makers. And for me, it was this first integration of my passion for sustainability, community, and for business. And remember all that boring business stuff that my family did. Now all of a sudden it was really useful. It became like a treasure trove of information for me to be able to tap my family. Both of my parents were entrepreneurs, and my siblings, and get to ask them lots of questions, and to be able to finally integrate these things. And we attracted some pretty amazing investors, which was really interesting for me. We had this incredible investor named Randy, who was so inspired by our company, and he was so supportive. And we couldn't believe that there were really investors out there who both provided capital to our crazy idea, but also Randy saw our company as a vehicle for him to apply his capital for change. And that was something new for me, that an investor would actually seek out companies as his vehicle for making a difference in the world. So this is an article that was done on us that I liked. This revolution will be digitized. This is one of my partners now we sold our company in 2007, and Randy and Sunny asked me to join them in launching this investment firm that could fund companies like Zods. And the two of them, the two managing partners, Randy and Sunny, were ready to risk everything for this idea that we need to connect capital directly with companies. And this idea that having shared values between the investors and the executives actually does make a difference. And that providing patient capital for a sustainable future is the antidote to what Sunny calls short-term-itis. That was him presenting to TEDx about what the cure for short-term-itis is. And you know, after spending a heck of a lot of time with idealists, I realized that there's this massive gap between what people envisioned creating in the world and what they were able to manifest, and that funding actually plays a huge part in building that bridge between what people envision and what they're able to manifest. And I realized that we can envision a sustainable future, and we can philosophize about it, and we can design it, but until we fund it, we can't build it. And so the question that then I began living as I joined Satori Capital was, again, what can I do that matters? And can I catalyze capital to move into restorative ventures? And Alan synthesized this idea yesterday of the great disconnection. And he really synthesized it brilliantly if you saw his presentation. And so I would like to invite people to join me in the great reconnection of reconnecting capital to creating value in the world so that we can ask ourselves a different question. Instead of asking, how much did I make, we can ask, how much did it mean? One of my philosophical mentors, Michael Strong, has this call to action. He says, dare to create authentic value. So going back to that question of what do you do, when people ask me, I tell them that I'm an investor. I'm an operating partner at a private equity firm. And depending on who it is, I notice that their response changes. If they're someone from the business, investment, government world, they usually nod approvingly because I have a serious profession and I'm not likely a burden on society in any way. But if it's somebody from these changemaker communities, they kind of look at me skeptically like, sell out, because they're thinking like, how can you engage in capitalism that is part of the problem? And then we have some discussions around that, and then they ask me if my company would be interested in funding their little venture, or donating or sponsoring their cool new Change the World project that is not capitalistic in any way. But but really, like, what I discovered is that investing can be a vehicle for activism if it has the right intention, if the person applying the capital has the right intention towards it. And I'm accustomed to the fact that it's really hard for people to understand that investing is a vehicle for activism, because activism frightens investors and investors are frightened of activists. And no one really believes that you can bat for both teams. But for me, this integration was a natural expression of what I'm uniquely here to do. I share this story not only because I want you to get excited about the opportunities in impact investing and to begin to direct capital into creating the world that we want to live in, but also, this sounds the way I've told my story. It's kind of like I'm like this happy-go-lucky Forrest Gump that stumbled onto these awesome opportunities, and it's really great. But I really wanted to talk about what the deeper emotional question that I was asking myself and still ask myself is, how can I handle this? How can I handle all this pain and suffering that I see in the world? Because there's been times where I've laid in bed crying because I was so scared that we were on the verge of collapse and that I had to do something. Can you relate to what that feels like? To live in this state of perpetual despair, feeling so small, and that feeling that you have to do something is so overwhelming that you can't seem to be at peace until you've done something. And so you run around doing everything, but you can't do enough, because you could recycle for a year and you could swear off plastic and you can buy all the eco options and you can donate as much as you want to all of your favorite charities and political candidates, but it still wouldn't be enough for one person to change everything. I was pulled in 1,000 directions at once and unable to focus on any of these things long enough to see any results. And I desperately wanted to do something meaningful that could help resolve some of the world's crises. But as I tried to step up and take some responsibility in my life, And with my actions, I learned how inextricably interconnected I was with everything. And it seemed like everything I did had this terrible negative consequence in the world. And yet none of the things that I seemed to do seemed to matter. And it was like this paradox of everything mattered and nothing matters. And I was enmeshed in these problems of the world. And that really, no matter what I did, I was stuck in this perspective that things are getting worse. Things are just getting worse. And it was a frame of mind in which I entirely resided. And when this is going on in your head, it's really hard to answer that question of what can I do? And I realized that there are other people stuck in this frame of mind as well. And I met this one activist once that was an animal rights activist, and I admired her so much. And when I met her, I came up to her and said, it's amazing what you've done. You've got this major Fortune 500 company to be able to change their ways, and I'm really just in awe of everything that you've done. And she said to me, I'm not going to be happy until all animals are free from human enslavement. And I thought, wow, that's a really long time to wait to be happy. I mean, I don't want to mock it, but it's true. I mean, it hit me like if you know, of course, anger and suffering are these organic emotions that are the responses to all of this. But if we feel only sad and angry, then we never allow ourselves to also rejoice when our actions do make a difference. But I've also swung to the complete opposite pole, which is everything is actually getting better. And I found more and more and more people like you who are out there who make my jaw drop with all the amazing things that everyone's doing. I see there's, you know, biomimetic buildings and water machines that clean the filthiest water and cradle-to-cradle products that cycle infinitely into new products and never reaching the grave of landfills. And being in the room with people like you, I know that things are getting better. And not only did I really like holding this perspective, but it gave me a lot of juice. And I was not alone after all, and the world was not on my shoulders, and that together we could do something. I began then to entirely inhabit this point of view. So the question I was asking myself, when, you know, how can I handle all this suffering? The answer was, avoid the question and don't deal with it. In fact, now these like desperate, loud, angry, activist-y types were just so obnoxious. Like I didn't want them to rock my boat or burst my bubble. I didn't want to hear the bad news because everything I did was big and very important, and I avoided books and people and events that were all focused on these problems. And if there were problems, I was sure that somebody out there was working on it. You know, there's a lot of other people out there that were like, right now, that are like how I was then. And although I'm also, again, borrowing Alan's terminology to make this point, that perhaps the great disconnection in the marketplace is the reflection of the disconnection inside ourselves. Another quick story, I know this one CEO of a big consumer goods company. They sell mostly chocolate and candy. And he's a really good guy, like a really good family guy. And he's responsible for this major multinational corporation. And I once asked him, do you know where your cacao comes from, or whether those people are getting fair prices, or anything about the, you know, or do you, what do you think about, you know, would you ever think about where all that non-recyclable plastic goes after the people that you're selling it to are done using it? And he would just say, hey, I'm the candy man. Candy is for everyone. Candy is cheap and fun. And when I asked him how he felt when he saw an obese child slurping down these calories and added colorings and fat, did he still feel this candy is cheap and fun? I mean, did he feel anything inside about his responsibility for that child? And he said, actually, you know, kids' eating habits really wasn't his responsibility. His responsibility was to grow the company and ensure the increased profitability kept investors happy. And he was proud that he was doing a great job in his role. But I think that in order to walk into work every day, he had to block it all out and disconnect from the global consequences of his actions in order to stay focused on the positive outcomes that made him feel successful. And you know, it's really a shame because he was really in a position to create major change, but he couldn't open his eyes or his heart enough to realize it. I believe that there are a lot of people out there like this. We talked about the status quo and this idea of people being attached to keeping the dysfunctional for their own, to keeping things dysfunctional for their own benefit. But I would like to introduce the idea that many of these people are too afraid to be present to the suffering in the world because they would just be risking too much. They just build up this wall of denial and then defend those walls, because if they didn't, they would have to question everything that they believe to be true. There's a whole world out there of people that are too afraid to be challenging their beliefs. So, because my time is up, I'm going to skip ahead to what my do is. I want to say that our problems are getting more and more complex, but we're also rising to the challenges and designing new ways of resolving our problems. And this moment in time is so magnificently minor in the whole spectrum of time. And these stars are being born, and stars are dying, and galaxies are colliding and imploding in a constant dance of creation and destruction. And here we are on this island in time, enjoying our little slice of life. And this now is the most precious thing we've got. Nothing about our world is the way things are. That was just a myth that the grown-ups told us. And I realized how I'd squandered so much of my energy chasing after things which I had no power to change. And I skipped the whole part, but now I was no longer chasing after 1,000 things that all needed to be done, but I was opening up into the way in which I, and uniquely I, can be useful. So here's my big do. Skipping ahead, sorry. Is to pause the doing. I'd like you all to pull out a paper and pen if you have one, either now or right afterwards, and close your eyes if you don't have a piece of paper and imagine yourself answering this question. What is the question that I am living now? Because what I'm suggesting is not really any grand plan. It's just a simple practice, a way of witnessing and opening and grounding and clearing the clutter, and occasionally pausing this constant rumination in our minds so we can listen for our own authentic answers. Because as we learned yesterday from John, that system one, this reptilian brain is firing on all emotional cylinders, responding to all the excitable ads that Brain Juicer is tossing at you. And system two is busy weighing all these options, the pros and cons, forecasting all the potential scenarios. But somewhere in the center of that information and emotion, there is a space to anchor in this now. Somewhere there is a knowingness all your own. And somewhere your own unique wisdom becomes activated. And just for now, breathe into those questions and find that little slice of silence inside. And when you find it, even if it's for a half of a second, listen carefully, because this is your yes. It might be shouting at you, but you've been too busy to hear it. Or it might be so quiet that it's barely audible. It might be like a song being sung in your heart that only you can hear. And as you tune in, you can turn up the volume. Or it might be like a tiny flame, smaller than a half of a matchstick that only you can kindle. But when you do, it will rise in you and feed the fire of your passion. And this is living your intention. This is living your yes. And this is choosing what to do by what you must do. And it's in the nexus of where your passion for what you must do meets that which only you can do or influence. Because we talk about sustainability, and sustainability is this capacity to endure. But if we want sustainability out there, we need to become sustainable in here. Because we can't even imagine how the world will change. And what we need to do is become resilient inside. We don't need any more people on autopilot going on as if this is just the way things are. We don't need any more desperate people rushing around trying to change those other people. We need to become alive inside as we have never been before. We need to become more compassionate and inclusive than we have ever been before. Because we here, leaders of today, are the most powerful architects of the future. And we can choose to create. And we are just one small part of everything. And everything matters. Just have my... not going to get there. Sorry, I want to skip to my last slide, but I can't get there. Okay, everything matters.